The air in the basement of the Jefferson County Courthouse tasted of floor wax and old paper, a suffocating atmosphere that Elias Thorne had endured for 3 hours. He sat in the back row of the public auction, his large frame cramped into a folding metal chair that groaned every time he shifted. Beside him, Radar sat like a statue, his amber eyes tracking the auctioneer's gavel with predatory focus. Most of the properties being moved were overgrown timber lots or collapsed barns, sold for thousands to local developers who didn't even look up from their phones. Then came Parcel 402, the Vance estate. The room went uncomfortably quiet. The auctioneer cleared his throat, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. "Minimum bid $500, he mumbled, his voice lacking its usual cadence. No one moved. No one breathed. The local legends about the cabin on the ridge, the disappearance of the brilliant Sarah Vance, and the curse of the land were worth more than any timber yield. Elias didn't hesitate. He raised a calloused hand, the movement slow and deliberate. "500, he said, his voice a gravelly contrast to the silence. The gavel fell before anyone could breathe a word of protest. 10 minutes later, Elias stood at the clerk's window, clutching a yellowed, ink-stained deed to a property he had never seen. He tucked the paper into the inner pocket of his M65 field jacket, feeling the weight of the mountain already pressing down on him. He walked out of the courthouse and straight into his truck, the rain beginning to fall in heavy, rhythmic pulses against the windshield. He knew he needed a local's perspective before he climbed the ridge. He put the truck in gear and headed toward the only place still open in the valley, the Rusty Spur Diner. The bell above the door of the Rusty Spur Diner gave a pathetic, tinny chime as Elias Thorne stepped inside, a sound that seemed to struggle against the oppressive humidity of the morning. The air inside was a thick, stagnant soup of burnt coffee, congealed bacon grease, and the distinct metallic scent of a rainy Appalachian morning that had finally permeated the walls. Elias didn't look for a seat in the center. He moved with the practiced ease of the man who never wanted his back to an open room. He slid into a corner booth, the cracked vinyl groaning under his weight like a weary animal. Beneath the table, Radar took his place instantly, a silent shadow that didn't so much as sniff at the floor. The diner was quiet, occupied only by a couple of old-timers in the corner, whose conversation died the moment Elias's boots hit the floorboards. In this part of the mountains, a stranger wasn't just a visitor. A stranger was a variable that nobody had asked for. When the waitress approached, her name tag reading Mabel in faded cursive, she didn't lead with a greeting or a menu. She stared at the mud on Elias's boots, a thick ochre clay unique to the higher elevations, and then at the courthouse deed sticking out of his jacket pocket. "You're the one," she said, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "The one who bought the Vance place for $500. It wasn't a question. Elias simply nodded, ordering his coffee black. He watched her hand tremble slightly as she poured, the liquid sloshing over the rim of the thick ceramic mug. She leaned in then, her face a map of genuine concern etched in deep lines. "They call it a ghost story to keep the local kids from wandering onto that land," she whispered, glancing back at the old-timers who were now pointedly staring into their plates. But Sarah Vance wasn't no spirit. She was a girl from the city, a high-level architect for that big outfit, Apex Solutions. Smartest thing on 2 legs, they say. She moved out there 10 years ago, looking for the kind of quiet you probably think you're going to find. But Sarah found something in the code she brought home with her, something that made the big men in suits very, very nervous. Mabel wiped the counter with a rag that had seen better decades, her eyes never leaving Elias's. One night, the lights went out on that mountain, and Sarah just stopped being. No body, no trail, just a cabin full of half-finished tea and a car still sitting in the drive with the keys in the ignition. The county took it for taxes eventually, but nobody touched it because nobody wanted what came with it.
They say if you listen close when the wind kicks up, you can hear the clicking of a keyboard. But I reckon what people are really scared of isn't a ghost, it's whatever killed her. That land has a way of swallowing people who ask the wrong questions, Mr. Thorne." Elias took a slow sip of the bitter, scorched coffee, his eyes fixed on the misty tree line visible through the grime-streaked window. He didn't believe in hauntings, but he knew plenty about the men in suits who used the dark to bury their mistakes. He paid for the coffee, left a $5 tip, and walked out into the damp air, the ghost of Sarah Vance now sitting in the passenger seat of his truck as he turned the truck toward the ridge.
The truck groaned as Elias shifted into low gear, the tires churning through the thick ochre mud of the access trail that Mabel had warned him about. The further he drove into the foothills, the more the forest seemed to actively reclaim the path, with briars clawing at the paint of his old pickup like skeletal fingers. The canopy of ancient oaks grew so dense that the midday sun was reduced to a sickly, greenish twilight, making the shadows between the trees appear deeper than they had any right to be. Radar sat upright in the passenger seat, his ears swiveling like dual radar dishes, his body a coiled spring of calculated muscle. He wasn't relaxed, he was scanning. Elias felt the familiar cold prickle at the base of his neck, the tactical intuition that had kept him alive through 3 tours as a combat engineer. It was the feeling of being watched by something that didn't have a heartbeat. The cabin finally came into view, a jagged silhouette of graying timber perched on a shelf of jagged granite. It looked like a rotting tooth in a mouth of green. Elias killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal under the hood. He didn't step out immediately. Instead, he reached into the glove box for his binoculars. He didn't look at the cabin first. He looked at the perimeter. His eyes swept the tree line, searching for the unnatural, things that were too symmetrical, too perfect for the beautiful chaos of nature. There, 50 yards to the left, nestled in the deep, corky bark of a white oak, was a glint that didn't belong to a wet leaf. He adjusted the focus, his breath hitching in his chest. It was a high-speed, infrared-capable trail camera camouflaged with professional-grade, weather-sealed housing. He panned right, following the logical line of sight. Another one was mounted high in a pine, angled perfectly to catch the rear exit of the cabin. These weren't the cheap plastic devices a local hunter would buy at a sporting goods store. These were networked, solar-powered units capable of real-time data transmission via a localized mesh network. "Someone's still keeping the bill paid, Radar," Elias muttered, his voice sounding thin in the heavy air. He stepped out of the truck, the mud squelching under his boots with a wet, sucking sound. He felt the invisible weight of a dozen electronic eyes tracking his every move, logging his gait and his height into some distant server. He wasn't just a homeowner, he was a guest in a monitored cell. He walked toward the porch, purposefully keeping his hands visible and away from his waistband, his mind already calculating the blind spots in the digital coverage. The Vance property wasn't just abandoned land, it was a live site and piece of infrastructure that was still being maintained from afar. As he reached the front door, he noticed the dust on the threshold hadn't been disturbed in years, yet the lenses of the cameras were pristine, wiped clean of mountain grime and pollen. The contrast was chilling. Sarah Vance was gone, but the system she had triggered was still very much alive, and Elias had just walked right into its center. The heavy iron key turned in the lock with a groan of neglected metal, a sound that seemed to echo far too loudly in the unnatural stillness of the ridge. As Elias pushed the door open, he was met by a wall of air that felt like a physical weight, stagnant, cold, and smelling of ancient dust and fossilized silence. He stepped across the threshold, his boots thumping on wide planked floorboards that creaked like a living thing under his gear. He didn't move deep into the room immediately. He stood just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust to the dim, greenish light filtering through windows choked with decade-old grime. Radar entered beside him, his tail low and his nose working the air with surgical precision, his claws clicking softly on the wood.
The interior of the cabin was a macabre time capsule, a snapshot of a Tuesday 10 years ago that had simply refused to end. It wasn't the disarray of a struggle that chilled Elias, but the eerie normalcy of it. On the scarred oak table, a ceramic mug sat with a dark, dried ring of tea at the bottom, a silver spoon resting against the rim, as if Sarah Vance had just stepped into the next room to answer a phone. A half-eaten plate of what had once been pasta was now a gray, unidentifiable mound of mold and dust, and a paperback book lay splayed face down on the arm of a moth-eaten sofa, its spine cracked from years of sitting in the same position. It looked less like a home and more like a museum exhibit dedicated to a disappearance. Elias moved with a sapper's caution, his eyes cataloging the decay, while his hands searched for the structural anomalies he had been trained to find in the caves of the Middle East. He checked the corners for tripwires and the floorboards for pressure plates, a habit he couldn't break even in the civilian world. The logs of the cabin were solid enough, heart pine that had hardened into something like iron over the decades, but the insulation was shot and the smell of mice and damp rot was pervasive. He reached the back office, a cramped room that felt different from the rest of the house. The air here was drier, and it carried a faint, sharp scent, the smell of ozone and old plastic. He ran his calloused fingers along the cedar paneling of the back wall, feeling for the slight catch in the grain or the uneven seam that signaled a hidden void. He found it behind a stack of rotting National Geographics from 2014. A section of the wall didn't just vibrate, it felt unnaturally cold, as if it were drawing air from a hidden cooling source. Elias wedged his combat knife into the seam and pried with a slow, steady pressure. With a sharp, sudden crack of splintering wood, a hidden panel swung inward on silent, greased hinges. Behind it wasn't a crawlspace or a dusty shelf, but a vertical server rack, its matte black finish untouched by the dust that choked the rest of the cabin. The cooling fans were stationary, but a single rhythmic amber light blinked on the interface, a low-power heartbeat sustained by a battery backup that had somehow survived the decade. This wasn't a home office, it was a hardened data node, a piece of high-tier corporate infrastructure hidden in a $500 shack. Sarah Vance hadn't just been a coder, she had turned this cabin into a digital fortress that was still, on some level, breathing in the dark.
The amber breath of the hidden server seemed to act as a trigger for radar. The Belgian Malinois, usually a statue of disciplined silence, suddenly broke his stay and began to pace a tight, agitated circle near the stone hearth of the massive central fireplace. He wasn't growling at the door or looking for an external threat. His focus was entirely internal, his nose pressed deep into the gaps between the heavy floorboards. Elias dropped to his knees, watching the dog's intensity with a growing sense of unease. He knew that radar wasn't tracking the scent of meat, fur, or even a human intruder. The dog was alerting to something else, a specific frequency of vibration or the sharp ionized tang of an active electrical current that bypassed the normal senses of a man. "Show me, boy," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the sudden, rhythmic patter of a fresh rainstorm hitting the tin roof. Radar didn't bark. He began to paw frantically at a specific floor joist, his claws scratching a frantic rhythm of desperation against the ancient, blackened wood. Elias leaned in close, his own senses heightening as he mimicked the dog's posture. He caught it then, the faint, unmistakable metallic scent of heated copper and the hot smell of a high-capacity lithium-ion battery. The dog whined, a low, urgent sound that Elias had heard only once before, years ago in Helmand, right before they had uncovered a massive buried IED cache. Whatever was buried under these boards wasn't just a secret. It was live. It was powered. It was hot.
As Elias reached into his pack for his heavy crowbar to investigate the source of radar's distress, the cabin's windows rattled with a sudden violent vibration that felt like an earthquake. It wasn't the server rack, and it wasn't the dog. The mountain itself seemed to groan, a deep-seated structural roar that began as a low-frequency hum in the floorboards and quickly escalated into a deafening cascade of snapping timber and grinding stone. Elias scrambled to his feet, heart hammering, and looked through the grime-streaked window. The relentless Appalachian rain had finally done its work. A massive mudslide, fueled by weeks of saturation, was tearing down the steep slope behind the cabin. He watched in stunned silence as the access bridge, his only umbilical cord to the valley below, was snatched away like a toy made of matchsticks and swallowed by the earth. The dirt track he had navigated only hours ago was now buried under 10 feet of liquid slurry and uprooted hemlocks. He was cut off, he was isolated, and in the sudden, ringing silence that followed the slide, a low-pitched mechanical drone rose from the tree line, its red sensor eye hovering just outside the broken glass, watching him as he knelt over the secret radar had found. The trap hadn't just been set, it had just been sprung. The sound began as a low-frequency vibration in Elias's molars before it ever reached his ears. It was a visceral, sub-bass growl that seemed to emanate from the very roots of the mountain, a sound of the earth itself losing its grip. Radar's ears pinned back instantly, and he scrambled toward the center of the room, his paws skidding on the dusty floorboards. Elias stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy crowbar he'd pulled from his toolkit. He knew that sound. It was the roar of a geological collapse. Outside, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the relentless Appalachian rain had finally turned the steep, shale-heavy slopes into a fluid, deadly slurry. He moved to the window just in time to see the world dissolve. A massive wall of mud, uprooted hemlocks, and jagged boulders cascaded down the ravine behind the cabin. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of snapping timber and grinding stone that felt like a freight train passing through the kitchen. Elias watched as the access bridge, his only umbilical cord to the valley below, was snatched away like a toy made of matchsticks. The dirt track he had navigated only hours ago was replaced by a churning river of chocolate-colored filth and debris. The cabin shuddered on its granite shelf, the logs groaning under the pressure of the shifting ground, but the foundation held. As the roar subsided into a wet, heavy silence, a new sound emerged, one that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. It was a high-pitched mechanical whine, steady and deliberate. Through the mist and the settling dust, a sleek black quadcopter drone rose from the tree line. It didn't drift with the wind, it fought it with stabilized precision. It hovered 10 feet from the porch, its gimbal-mounted camera lens swiveling until it locked directly onto Elias. The red LED of its infrared sensor blinked once, twice, like a predatory eye. He wasn't just trapped by nature, he was being observed by a hunter that didn't care about the mud. The isolation he had paid $500 for had just become a cage, and the owners of the drone were the ones holding the keys. Elias felt the familiar coldness of combat focus settle over him. He wasn't a homeowner anymore. He was a target in a secured perimeter, and the storm had just ensured there would be no witnesses to whatever happened next. Elias didn't waste time staring back at the drone. He knew that in a tactical environment, once a target was locked by eyes in the sky, the extraction team wouldn't be far behind. He turned back to the hearth, where radar was still pacing, his nose pressed to the specific seam in the floorboards he had flagged minutes before. "Out of the way, boy," Elias muttered, his voice tight with adrenaline. He jammed the flat end of the crowbar into the gap between the heavy oak planks and the stone of the fireplace. The wood resisted, the ancient nails shrieking as they were forced out of the joists with a sound like pistol shots. With a final splintering heave, a 3-foot section of the floor came free, revealing a hidden compartment. Beneath the boards, nestled in a hollowed-out section of the main support beam, was a matte black pelican case. It was bolted directly into the granite foundation, sealed with a digital keypad that was still glowing with a faint ghostly blue light. This was the source of the ozone smell radar had detected. Elias used the wire cutters from his kit to snip the mounting bolts, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hauled the case onto the table, the weight of it suggesting more than just papers. He didn't have the code, but he had a sapper's knowledge of forced entry. He used a small flathead to bypass the locking pins, and the lid popped with a pressurized hiss. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay a high-capacity solid-state drive labeled Dead Man Switch and a prototype tracking chip that looked more like a piece of alien jewelry than consumer tech. The drive was warm to the touch, and as he lifted it, the server rack behind the false wall chirped in response. A secondary uplink had been triggered by the physical removal of the case. He realized then that Sarah Vance hadn't just hidden her data. She had created a system that would only activate when someone was brave enough to dig it up. But the prototype chip was the real problem. It began to pulse with a steady, aggressive red light. It wasn't just tracking the data, it was broadcasting Elias's exact coordinates to whoever owned that drone outside. The secret was out of the joist, and the countdown to a confrontation had officially begun. He looked at Radar, who was now staring at the door with his hackles raised. The guest list for this cabin was about to get a lot longer, and Elias needed to decide if he was going to be the prey or the trap.
The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on saturated earth reached Elias's ears long before the figures emerged from the gray veil of the Appalachian mist. It was a cadence he recognized with a sinking clarity, the disciplined, synchronized stride of a fire team moving in a tactical wedge. Radar stood by the splintered section of the floor, his body low to the ground, a vibrating growl resonating in his chest like a distant engine. Through the grime-streaked window, 3 men materialized. They were dressed in high-visibility orange search and rescue vests, but the gear beneath told a different story. They wore dark, weather-resistant tactical shells, and their movements were too precise, their eyes scanning the tree line with a professional paranoia that had nothing to do with looking for lost hikers. "Halloo the house," the lead man shouted, his voice a polished, commanding baritone that carried a note of feigned concern. "Jefferson County SAR, we saw the slide from the ridge. You okay in there?" Elias stood deep in the shadows of the kitchen, his hand resting on the hilt of his combat knife. He didn't look at their faces, he looked at their feet. They were wearing professional-grade tactical boots with aggressive tread patterns designed for rapid movement, not the heavy, clunky hiking boots of local volunteers. Furthermore, their vests sat unnaturally high and heavy against their chests, clearly concealing suppressed sidearms and ceramic ballistic plates. There were no medical kits visible, no stretchers, and no rescue ropes coiled over their shoulders. Elias remained silent, watching the lead man signal to his companions with a subtle flick of 2 fingers, a nonverbal flank and clear command. They weren't there to rescue a homeowner. They were a recovery team sent by Apex Solutions to retrieve the Pelican case and ensure that whatever Sarah Vance had buried stayed hidden under the mountain's mud. The $500 Elias had paid for this cabin hadn't bought him a retirement, it had bought him a front-row seat to a corporate execution. He signaled Radar to move toward the back bedroom, his mind already shifting into the cold, calculated state of a sapper under siege. The facade of the search and rescue team was crumbling by the second, and as the lead man's hand reached for the heavy iron door handle, Elias knew the time for dialogue had passed. The transition from a feigned rescue to an overt assault happened in the heartbeat between the intruders realizing the door was barred and the activation of their electronic countermeasures. Elias reached for his handheld emergency radio, hoping to catch a local sheriff's frequency, but he was met with a thick, impenetrable wall of static. The Apex team had deployed a localized frequency jammer, a digital bubble that effectively erased the cabin from the modern world. Then the low hum of the server rack behind the false wall faltered and died. The lights in the cabin flickered twice before plunging the room into a suffocating gray twilight. They had found the external power line and severed it with surgical precision. In the total silence that followed the power cut, the intruders didn't rush the door. Instead, they began the psychological phase of the breach. Elias could hear the soft crunch of their boots on the gravel, a rhythmic metronome designed to wear down his nerves. They were circling, tapping on the exterior logs to test for structural weaknesses or hidden exits, their silhouettes passing by the windows like ghosts. They were letting the darkness and the isolation do the heavy lifting, waiting for the civilian inside to crack under the pressure of being cut off from the world. Elias moved through the dark with the muscle memory of a man who had spent half his life in blackouts. He didn't need the lights. He knew exactly where he had placed the heavy iron skillet, the stripped copper wire from the server rack, and the small canisters of propane for the camping stove. He began to weave his own web in the shadows, turning the household items into a perimeter of deterrence. If they wanted a war of nerves, they had picked the wrong veteran to play with. He felt the heat of the solid-state drive in his pocket, Sarah's legacy, and the weight of it gave him a grim, sharpened clarity. He wasn't just defending a house, he was defending a truth that had been silenced for a decade. As the first flashbang grenade rolled onto the porch, shattering the silence of the mountain with a blinding white light, Elias took a deep breath. The hunters were about to find out that he was the most dangerous thing on this mountain. The flashbang detonated with a bone-jarring thrum, a wave of overpressure that shattered the remaining glass in the front windows and sent a cloud of ancient dust billowing from the rafters. To a civilian, the world would have dissolved into a white, ringing void of sensory overload. To Elias Thorne, it was merely the starting gun. He was already flat against the floorboards, his mouth slightly open to equalize the pressure in his ears, his hand gripped firmly on radar's harness. The Belgian Malinois didn't flinch. He had been bred and broken in the thunder of controlled breaches, and his muscles were coiled like high-tension springs. As the acrid, metallic smell of magnesium flare filled the room, the front door finally yielded to a heavy, tactical battering ram. The oak frame splintered like matchsticks, and the door swung wide, admitting the gray, misty light of the dying day. The Apex recovery team moved in a professional three-man stack, their suppressed weapons leading the way, the red dots of their laser sights dancing through the swirling smoke like fireflies. They expected to find a disoriented, terrified veteran cowering in a corner. Instead, they found a ghost who had spent the last 20 minutes turning a kitchen into a kill zone. Elias had used the moments of darkness to rig the server rack's heavy copper wiring across the threshold, anchored to the stove's main gas line. As the lead man stepped forward, Elias kicked the camping stove's ignition from behind the stone hearth. A localized burst of flame and a sharp electrical arc erupted, not designed to kill, but to divide the unit. The stack broke instantly. Two men stumbled back onto the porch to avoid the flare-up, while the third was forced deeper into the kitchen, isolated from his support. Radar was a streak of black fur and fury before the intruder could level his weapon. The dog hit the man with the force of a high-speed collision, his jaws locking onto the reinforced forearm of the shooter's primary hand. Elias didn't hesitate. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a sapper, using a heavy iron skillet as a bludgeon to neutralize the intruder's weapon before slamming him into the granite hearth with a sickening thud. Outside, the remaining two men realized the civilian was a professional and began a rhythmic suppression fire, the thwip, thwip of suppressed rounds chewing through the cedar logs. They were pinned,
the mudslide at their back, and an elite kill team at their front, but Elias had one card left to play. He jammed the prototype tracking chip into the server's auxiliary port, a final, desperate gamble. The dead man's switch wasn't just a drive, it was a beacon. As he activated the uplink, a brilliant, high-intensity searchlight swept over the cabin from above. Not the drone, but the spotlight of a state police interceptor, alerted by the federal-level breach notification the drive had just triggered. The Apex team froze, caught in the sudden glare of legal and literal light. The fight was over.
The silence that followed the arrival of the federal authorities was heavier than the storm. Within an hour, the mud-caked ridge was a hive of activity, swarmed by agents in dark windbreakers that didn't say Apex. The search and rescue team had been zip-tied and led away, their fake IDs discarded in the mud like the lies they were. Elias sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over his shoulders, while a medic checked a minor laceration on his temple. Radar sat at his feet, his tail giving an occasional weary thump against the metal. The Belgian Malinois was the only one in the clearing who looked completely unfazed by the night's events. A man in a sharp charcoal suit, one that actually fit, approached Elias, holding the pelican case with a level of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. "Mr. Thorne," the agent said, his voice low, "you have no idea what you've just handed us. This data doesn't just implicate Apex, it maps out a decade of corporate espionage that reaches into the highest offices in the country. Sarah Vance was a hero, but she needed someone with your specific set of skills to make sure her message got out." Elias looked at the man, then at the ruined cabin, its front door hanging by a single hinge. The $500 he had paid at the courthouse had bought him a front-row seat to the truth, and for the first time in years, the noise in his head had gone quiet. He had come to the mountain to disappear, but in the process, he had made sure Sarah Vance would never be forgotten. As the sun began to crest the eastern ridges, painting the Appalachian mist in shades of gold and amber, Elias stood up. He wasn't going to stay in the cabin. It was a crime scene now, and the isolation he once craved felt like a hollow goal. He had a dog, he had a truck, and he had the gratitude of a government that usually ignored men like him. He looked at Mabel's diner down in the valley, where the lights were likely just coming on for the breakfast shift. He owed her a story, and maybe a real cup of coffee. He whistled for radar, climbed into the truck, and turned the key. The engine turned over on the first try, a steady, reliable rhythm that signaled a new beginning. He drove away from the ridge, leaving the ghosts of Sarah Vance and his own past buried under the mountain, finally ready to rejoin a world he had tried so hard to leave behind.